welcome everybody from a little bit of a soggy Nashville today in the middle of what we would somewhat call spring break. Spring break's a little different this year. It's much shorter because we started later to kind of stay out of the way of COVID back there in January where things are raging. So that strategy actually has worked quite well for us because things are substantially better in Nashville now than they were back in January, and we were glad not to be starting up in the middle of all of that. And the semester is going well, and our students are taking a very small breather. The Owen students today are having a day called Owen Impact Day. They spent the morning working with our Center for Social Ventures on projects with local non-for-profits, all kinds of fun stuff like making flower bouquets for local nursing homes and blankets and just all kinds of good fun stuff, and the chance to be together, which becomes a treasured thing in COVID, to be able to bring people together for unstructured time like that. So really been a great day. And then this afternoon, we've been focused on this issue of sustainability and really having an exciting set of panels. If you missed the earlier two panels, we started off with Professors Cohen and Vandenberg talking about where sustainability is going on the curriculum side in the law school and in the business school, and how the business imperative is really driving tremendous interest in that subject. And then the second panel was really focused on looking at the specific projects at Vanderbilt, projects at Nike, and how companies like Nike are achieving their zero carbon energy goals through really innovative partnerships with utilities, with providers, and so forth. And our last panel today is really following on with that, but looking at it from a broader perspective, thinking about what that means for regions, for how you kind of drive these larger sustainability goals, not just across a single company, but across multiple companies and users and ultimately states and countries. So that's where we're headed today. And I have a really great panel that's with us. I'm going to remind all those watching today that if they want the best view of the session today, click up on the upper right-hand corner of your screen under view and switch to gallery view, as we've really produced this to work best in that format. And we are recording today's session because many of our alumni, of course, will be consuming this over the next few days as we push it out to all the Vanderbilt alumni system. But with no more than that, I want to begin to introduce our panel. And I'm going to do that quickly, but then give each of the panelists a little bit of time to do that themselves. We have with us Bill Berg, and Bill is the Vice President of Investment Relations for Energy Transfer, and I'll have him tell you a little bit about that here in a moment. Katrina Kaufman, Katrina Kaufman, who's the Chief Commercial Officer from Penn LNG, Pan America Energy Holdings. And then Professor Jim Rossi. Jim is in the law school and really a wonderful addition to the Vanderbilt faculty because he brings with him expertise in energy law and huge boost to the law school brain trust around this subject. So welcome, Jim. And then Lisa Ryder. Lisa is the Senior Vice President of Utilities, Power, and Renewable Energy at KeyBank Capital Markets, bringing us an investor perspective on this. So welcome, panelists. And I'm going to start, Bill, with you and just ask you to fill in a little bit more about your role and how that plays into this conversation around sustainability.
Well, thank you, and it's great to be here. And I have very fond memories of my time at Owen. It was a very transformative period. I graduated class of '95, so I was there back when Dean Johnson was winning the teaching awards and all that fun stuff on his first tour through. So, Actually, I was in school with Katrina, so it's actually great to see after all these years, the Owen family continues. So thanks again, and greetings here from Dallas, Texas. So yeah, as Dean Johnson said, I'm Vice President of Investor Relations. So I lead all of our activities when it comes to the outward voice with our investors, whether they're equity investors, stock, debt, and various functions throughout, like working with the rating agencies, things like that. On sustainability, that's becoming more and more of a focus. I've spent 25 years in this industry, and no one 25 years when I first started would even thought about sustainability or anything about that. As some of our first panel talked about, it's becoming more and more of an issue. So here internally, we have a department that's all they do is sustainability and the ESG team. So I help coordinate with them. One of the people that helps, in a team with our public relations, our government relations, legal, finance team. So kind of help bring all those teams together and bring it to bear. So I look forward to the discussion today, and we'll get into more details as we go forward. But thank you for having me.
Thank you, Bill. Katrina.
Hi, so I'm Katrina Kaufman. I graduated from Owen in '96 with Bill. So for 25 years, I've been in the energy business as well. I started in natural gas trading and moved into LNG, which is liquid natural gas, 25 years ago. So effectively, my whole career has been in the nat gas side of the world. And that is quite an international commodity as we see today in the United States, but it's been an international commodity across the board. So over the last 20 plus years, I've been with Chevron, I've been with other El Paso, other companies, joint ventures around the world. And so right now, my concentration as Chief Commercial Officer of Penn LNG is to put together a contractual value chain from the producers all the way to the LNG buyers around the world. So that would include shipping, piping, everything. And I can tell you first and foremost, and especially in the last 4 or 5 years, ESG has been our key priority to demonstrate. And that's exactly why I was excited to talk on this panel today with you guys. And obviously, I'm missing Nashville. I need to get back there and come and visit. So
Wonderful, Katrina. Thank you. Next up, Jim, please introduce yourself.
Sure. I began my career practicing energy law in Washington, D.C. in the early 1990s when there was a real focus on deregulation of electric power. And I entered into legal academia in the mid-90s and have continued to focus and write on energy issues. My big focus has been primarily on regulation of energy as a system and how we get all the regulators together to coordinate in that arena.
Thank you so much, Jim. And last but not least, Lisa.
Good afternoon. I started my career back at GE Capital in their energy financial services business. So I've been in the banking segment now for over 20 years, after which I went to Vanderbilt, class of 2006. And I have been with both PNC and now KeyBank in various underwriting capacities. So at KeyBank, I'm responsible for, bringing Key's balance sheet to the table where we bring value to our customers across the energy spectrum. My primary area of focus has been renewable clients, both in this independent power producer segment, but also regulated utilities that are looking to own these generation assets. And so, KeyBank as a whole, though, we're a full spectrum investment bank. We have equity and debt capital markets. We have ratings advisors that we, utilize. And we also have, a large M&A shop where we, represent buyers and sellers of these generation assets.
Awesome. Well, in the last session, we heard from a TVA executive the importance of natural gas in their own evolution away from coal and towards cleaner energy. And so I'll start with you, Katrina, and have us tell us a little bit about how Penn LNG is setting a new environmental standard by delivering cleaner natural gas solutions to the markets.
Well, We appreciate that plug, but effectively LNG in general, that not just Penn LNG, but LNG in general has been displacing higher carbon fuels across the world. And so in a lot of instances, we look at LNG as a global commodity. It trades like crude, but it's not like crude at all. It's very specific, it's very niche, and it's very difficult to trade. It's not a liquid market. So our goal is really to get a lot of countries to switch over from higher carbon fuels, coal, and other types of heavy fuel oils and high sulfur fuel oils that a lot of islands and other areas and emerging markets have been utilizing. And ironically, we're seeing even some countries that are 100% hydro are now switching over to LNG because the hydro is just not as reliable year round. So gas makes a really great, and I think Bill may talk more into this as what we call a baseload type of transaction, and the reliability and deliverability and security of supply for natural gas is critically important as we go through as a key commodity for any utilities and power supply or any of their generation issues.
Awesome. And specifically, tell us a little bit about the electric powered LNG facilities that you're building. And
so this is example. And as Bill mentioned, we're definitely focusing on a better ESG perspective. It's hard for us to understand in the United States because we've seen energy as maybe people who are a little bit behind the curtain. And in Japan, they have children's day trips to the LNG facility. So it's like a museum. They go, they sit at the LNG facility, but over here it's just big and scary. So it's a different perspective of how we do that. And we're taking a lot of the lessons learned in Japan and bringing them to the United States and looking at electrifying instead of using the natural gas, which has been historically sound, we're switching over to electric and just to clean up the NOx emissions. So it takes about 98% off the top of your emissions if you use electric for your facility. So we're looking at electric facilities versus gas, and it makes the value chain much more difficult because we know what the gas price is and we know those indices, but electricity is its own bit of, I don't know, it breeds its own issues. And so we look at that and we would look to people like Lisa on how would an investor look at the unknown, which is the electric. How do you lock that price in for 20 years? Because we know what the gas index is and we can put it through the chain. But commercially structuring with electricity is a little more difficult, but we are doing that. And we are moving forward with a very clean Marcellus ESG component to get this production to the world and looking at markets that are using basically coal. We're coal displacement or heavy fuel oil displacement.
That's great. Thank you, Katrina. Now, Bill, Katrina kind of teed you up there.
Always help.
Katrina, before Katrina, I think Texas teed up the world in beginning to talk about base load versus peak load and what that means. Can you tell us a little bit about that and then talk about how renewable energy needs really fit into that base load, peak load discussion?
Yeah, thank you. And just to step back just a second for those that may not be as familiar with some of this industry jargon, we're in kind of the transmission segment, which is the midstream, we call it, which is between the upstream, which is the production, the field, and then the downstream, which is the markets, refineries, things like that. So we're kind of like the toll road. And the way we make money is people pay us a toll to do that, which is really, for us and our investors, it provides some stability and it doesn't have the peaks and the troughs, and it provides a bit of a kind of a consistent cash flow stream there. So as Katrina was saying, a lot of our business is a utility, like we just recently saw in Texas. These utilities here in the state sign up for capacity on our pipelines to ensure that their natural gas will flow to their generation facilities or their utilities that provide natural gas to people's homes to heat them. So across the country, our company, Energy Transfer, moves about a third. If you think about a third of the natural gas and a third of the oil that moves through the entire United States moves through Energy Transfer's assets. We have 90,000 miles of pipeline and about 12,000 employees that help us do this job, and we do it safely, efficiently, and we make sure that we're being very, very sensitive to the environments in which we work. But end of the day, if we want to have safe, affordable energy, this is a very critical part of the energy mix here. So specifically to the question, though, that base load would be that utility would sign up for capacity on our pipeline, and it would ensure that their gas supply will get to their facilities. And those are some of the best customers we have, because they'll end up signing up for the maximum amount they need. Even though they may not use all of it, we still collect a fee. So it's a good business, and we very much take our roles in the critical part of the U.S. commerce very, very importantly. And energy. And we've heard a lot about energy security, as well as we've heard about sustainability and ESG and all that. And we see our role in this industry as very important.
Awesome, thank you. Well, Lisa, KeyBank Capital Markets is really a huge player in this renewable lending space, and really committed to it. As a leader in the market, what are some of the pros and cons of diversification of power sources?
Sure. One of the things, that it really stands to, help all citizens is it's a natural hedge against these extreme weather events, right? In Texas, we saw, the cold weather caused, wind turbines to not be able to spin because it was dangerous and too icy, or, there were certain wellheads that froze. Diversification of energy sources allows us to be a little bit more resilient when we have that hedge against, the environmental conditions. I think it also allows us flexibility to be most cost effective in an area where we're trying to deliver power as close to the demand source. So whether it's cities or it's rural areas, you want to design like a system that's most cost effective for end users, whether it's consumers or it's industrial end users. And that basically then, allows us to build a very efficient system with the right mix of energy generation sources that's appropriate for that region. Obviously, when you kind of look at this flexibility, decentralization could drive up cost, because you may have, more complexity to manage. And, you also lose somewhat of your economies of scale, coal generated large megawatts, and to replace those megawatts, you need not just one wind farm, you need multiple wind farms. So in each transaction, there's obviously, friction costs to get every new generation asset online, and, you lose those economies of scale in the process.
Great. Well, I want to kind of step back a little bit, and Professor Rossi, tell us a little bit about how has consumer understanding of clean energy changed?
That's a really good question. I think so far we've talked a lot about the supply side of the energy system, but the demand side of the energy system has also gone through some big changes in past decades. I think two things stand out to me. One is that energy is increasingly not just a physical commodity from the consumer perspective, it's a service. And as a service, consumers increasingly have expectations about both environmental and reliability attributes of the energy that they're consuming. And with markets and technology today, consumers are able to make choices, informed choices, right, regarding those attributes of their energy purchasing and use decisions. So that stands out to me as an increasing development and trend that we need to think about. Also, I think what we're seeing, and I think you alluded to this, Katrina, increasingly we're seeing a movement towards electrification as being a more efficient system for the delivery of energy to consumers, also a more environmentally conscious system for the delivery of energy. And we're seeing that, for example, with the shift towards electric vehicles and electric trucks and transport, and the like. And that increasingly is going to put a major strain on the electricity power generation and transmission system. And I think, Texas is really just the tip of the iceberg there as we think of the kinds of issues we're likely to see in coming decades.
Yeah, Jim, that
Well,
expectation is that that energy demand is going to quadruple in the next 20 to 25 years.
And if you couch that with the fact that I had some discussions with heads of giant entities in France, and he was saying, when you put all of that load into just the cars, just think about the cars, because we already had a peak time when we were trying to fulfill power needs when people got home from work. But now not only are they coming home from work and turning on 3 televisions, an iPad and everything, they're plugging in their car as well. And the reliability of your electricity becomes that much more important as you look at that peak, because our peak is going to go up even higher. Our base load goes up, but our peak is going to go up above that. And I think that's where you run into some issues with not having a balanced portfolio on supplies that can be base loaded, and then you layer more and more
Sure.
in. And
Sure.
I think you touched on, Professor Rossi, you touched on the key point of, Texas just the tip of the iceberg here, but as we electrify more things, instead of using the gas turbines and things like that for gas compression in the pipelines, we run into some issues like we saw this past winter, where if you're not declared a critical infrastructure, you might get cut. Your electricity gets cut. And if your electricity as a driller gets cut and your wells aren't heated and your pipelines can't do compressor stations because they're electric now, that causes some trickle through I'm not saying that's the whole issue, and by God, I'm not an expert on any of this, but on the fact that as we rely more on electricity and less on some of the things that are easier to peak up and down, I think it will be, Lisa raised a valid point, we're going to need that much more generation in an area where you touched on the consumers, they don't want anything, so you run into an issue of NIMBY, we call it, not in my backyard. And you run into the point where large cities where the demand is going to be the highest are the hardest to get to. So how do you do that? And that's where the challenges really come in. And you can do it, but how reliable will it be for investors? Because large cities change their policies very quickly. And you see a lot of that where I had one of my executives in a former company, he said that California was more risk than Bangladesh. And you are seeing that. Bangladesh signs an agreement and agrees to it and does the agreement. It's just very interesting that we are no longer politically stable for long-term agreements. And we see our Ex-Im Bank reaching out to change that perception and provide some guarantees for our global trade.
Sure. And if that's a problem with gas, it's even more of a problem with electric power in a market like Texas. So in Texas, as Bill was explaining, with baseload, you can rely on planning for peaks and you can build the capacity into long-term contracts and the like. But with electric power, at least in the Texas market, the way it's been deregulated, there is no compensation for that capacity, for having your capacity ready to go online. You're compensated in the real-time instantaneous market for the sale of wholesale power, but not for the commitments you might have on the sidelines. And that might be an issue that Texas regulators and legislators need to look at in the near future.
And it's the same for shipping. Like if you look at ships, people take a giant investment in crude tankers or LNG vessels. They're over $200 million a piece. And there are years where you're going to make that money on that crude vessel. And then there are years you're going to lose 3 years in a row. And we've seen a lot of shipping companies do that. Now they're switching over to LNG. So there's going to be some switching costs. I know Shell just announced that their crude carriers are going to switch to LNG fuel. And a lot of the ports are requiring it as well. So I think, you're going to see a different kind of cost wave come, and where that cost will be absorbed is really the question. Lisa's investors don't want to take all of that on. The producers can't take all of that on. So it is very interesting to see as we go forward with this different mix, how that allocates itself across the chain. Because as Bill said, you have to have for a pipeline, you have to have long-term customers every day, whether you use it or not.
But Bill, we've been talking about the Texas fiasco just a couple of weeks ago now. From where you sit, what went wrong there? And how does that
You
play
got the
into
hard
this
question, Bill.
Yeah, how does that play? How does that play into the
Thank you very much.
portfolio?
Just summarize that.
No, we're still trying to figure it. To be honest, they'll go on for years probably figuring it out. And actually, as an important company here in the state, you know, we actually were pretty involved in that. The governor's office was talking to our operations during it, and you know, we'll see what all happened. But I think there's some lessons learned, and at least in my seat right now, some of the things that we're seeing is, you know, our operations worked. You know, if you think about it, not to be a plug for our company, but our natural gas pipelines in the state and our storage fields provided the viable products that needed to heat our homes. You know, for an example, our storage fields here in Texas, on one of the days, it was about 5 days where they were all running a maximum withdrawal. About 1.7 BCF of gas was coming out of our facilities. That's enough to heat about 3 million homes on a daily basis. And our pipelines never stopped operating. You know, we do a lot of work in the pre-planning stages, but from a utility standpoint, what's happened over the last couple decades, actually, and as Professor Rossi mentioned, you know, deregulation has come in, and some of these utilities may not have wanted to sign up for gas storage or signed up for some of this actually access to the gas. You know, they'll sign up for the transmission, but they may not sign up for the storage. So I think some of these lessons that'll be learned and with the regulations and the state here, you know, they're going to look to see from a reliability standpoint, if you're going to be a contributor to the grid, you have to demonstrate that you're reliable, which goes to the renewable piece of it. And if you think about that, and to get back, to step back a little bit on the panel here, you know, from a transition standpoint, what we've seen in this state and across, you know, the country in general, if you think about the source of electricity, what was the fuel source in the past? It's typically been coal or some of these more of a dirty product. Today, natural gas represents 40% of electricity generation. Coal is only about a quarter. And last year, in 2019, was the first time in the state of Texas that wind power, the wind turbines on an annual basis, generated more power than any others than coal did. So actually, wind was replacing coal in Texas. Now, in the wintertime, grid wasn't relying on the renewable as much. So it wasn't, you know, there was a lot of debate whether renewables were at fault, or these, you know, the people saw the meme with the helicopter spraying, you know, antifreeze on some of these wind turbines. It made a nice light joke, but in reality, the grid wasn't relying on renewables during the coldest day of winter, because they just knew that, you know, that's not the big deal. But importantly for us here as a company, and we've seen this transition, the former governor, Rick Perry, is on our board of directors. And during his term here in Texas, which was from the early 2000 to 2015, the state of Texas grew its wind capabilities from about 116 megawatts to over 11,000 megawatts during his term. So critically important here in the state. And Texas actually is the largest wind generator in the entire country. There's only 5 states that really account for half of all the wind power. So we're going to see these trends evolve over time, but it's going to be important. It's going to take some time to get there. But as we're all saying here, you know, natural gas, I think, is going to be a key to the future here. And I don't think it's going away anytime soon. And especially like in the state of Colorado, for a good example, a former company I worked with was a pipeline that served power plants in Colorado. And if you wanted to build a renewable wind or solar plant, you had to demonstrate to the state, the utility commission, that you had reliability. So they had to sign up for natural gas pipelines. So, you know, that's why you'll see, you know, we get to some other debates, but, you know, from a sustainability standpoint, you can make a case that a natural gas company, even though it's a fossil fuel, is actually renewable, because the renewable projects wouldn't work without a base load of natural gas. And so, you know, it was several years ago, there was, you know, some of the, you know, you saw that on a renewable standpoint, Tesla was on the equivalence of ExxonMobil when it came to an ESG score. So that's a whole nother discussion about how getting standardization and kind of getting equality across the metrics. But it goes to show that, you know, from an energy perspective, I think it's important to look across the space. You know, wind, solar, all of these are becoming more and more of an important part of our business.
And Bill brings up weatherization. Katrina, you know, I think a lot of people were scratching their heads and thinking, why weren't we ready for this cold weather in Texas? And why wasn't the grid ready for it? What does that mean from the LNG side? Do you have a perspective on that?
LNG is an export from the United States now. So when I started my career, we were trying to bring it back to the United States because the Gulf Coast was declining at a 20% range. So before shale made any economic sense or technology had caught up with us, LNG was going to come into the United States. But if you look, like Freeport LNG, which is a great company located in Freeport, Texas, they actually are an electrified LNG plant, and they have contracts where they are required to produce and export volumes to customers. And the governor contacted them, and they had to deliver the one cargo that was already loaded, but they worked with the state to keep the gas in state as you go forward. And I think Texas is always very practical when it comes to those types of things. As Bill mentioned, a lot of those providers aren't forced to buy the capacity to back up their generation, and that's the problem. I mean, I think if you look at it, when it got too much, that a lot of people just said not producing today. So effectively, when you look at that, maybe some requirements along those lines, but you can't weatherize. I mean, nobody ever thought that every single county in the state of Texas at the same time would have 3 days of freezing temperatures. I mean, South Texas, the nuke went down. I mean, let's talk about a sensor on a nuke. So when sensors freeze and things freeze, you can't weatherize everything. I know Bill brought up a great point, because some of the things that they want us to do is like build a building around facilities. How much of your ESG was just taken up building the building? Because now you have to heat and air condition that facility that's protecting another facility. So it does bring up like what makes sense. We have to talk about what makes sense, and maybe Professor Rossi on the regulation side, maybe if you look at how the deregulation is supported, would probably be a better thing than multiple construction projects on deweatherizing compression facilities. I don't know, Lisa, what do you think? You're going to finance those? You're going to finance weatherizing in a market with no profit?
I think in some cases, there definitely needs to be rate design changes, right? Yes. There were legitimate weatherization issues brought up by the NERC report in 2011. And for those outside the industry, is, Texas had a freeze about 10 years ago. And there were some recommendations made that we in the industry knew of, and not all were followed through on. Now, again, this goes to a couple of fundamental points, which Jim knows, is what is your regulation? What entities are you regulated by? And then it's also cost, right? You have these consumer advocacy groups that are trying to make energy affordable for the end customer. Somewhere those folks have to strike a balance. Now, if something does become, worth the cost investment, we have to make sure that parties are complying with it. And when they're not, they're penalized heavily, right? Because otherwise we're just subsidizing the players in the industry that are, shortcutting, the capacity. And the system basically all fails when, we're not, providing enough capacity to weather the ups and downs of, all different types of events, and not just winter, but summer in Texas. But, from the diversity standpoint and the cost standpoint, is it cost that we're trying to optimize for when it comes to sustainability? Or is it, trying to, optimize the portfolio mix for zero emissions, And I think this is, one of the debates in our investor universe right now. There's definitely a universe where our investors want to see zero emissions by 2030, and that's where they want to invest their money. And obviously, in some markets, we have a little bit more regulatory clarity as to how these parties are going to get paid. But to Katrina's point, there are a lot of states and entities that up and change the rules very frequently. And it's made sort of it difficult to, decide where to invest as an investor in some cases. I think we've put some surety around different types of energy sources with the investment tax credit and the production tax credit that support wind and solar. We've made strides, obviously, with energy efficiency measures for consumers around, building HVAC systems and, making the consumer part of the solution. Demand shaping is as critical as the supply solution. So, everybody has their own idea here of what the optimal mix is, but I think we have to strike a balance between, cost, where we are feasibly technically today, and, if sustainability roadmap, like it's gonna have to be a very thought through, detailed plan with all parties at the table.
Lisa, I'm glad to hear you use the word plan. So when I think about this, Texas has been a bit of an ironic energy industry in the electric sector in particular for the last couple of years. On the one hand, they've had a market sort of approach for electric power that gives consumers lots of choices and allows generators to provide power on a competitive basis. That hasn't relied on a lot of central planning. On the other hand, for the transmission part of the equation, the transmission lines that have allowed the wind sector to thrive in Texas, they've relied a lot on a central planning process, and they've also relied on a cost allocation mechanism that allows them to spread the costs of transmission across customers on a statewide basis, almost to socialize the costs of transmission. And that's helped to boost investment in transmission and has provided that transmission backbone, which has allowed wind to thrive in Texas. In other parts of the country, we don't have as much investment in transmission in the areas where it's needed for wind or solar on a centralized basis to thrive. So I think part of what the struggle we're going to have to face in a state like Texas is to what extent, if we want to provide for some of these things like weatherization and reserve requirements, capacity requirements for generators, someone's going to have to pay for them. It's not going to be cheap, right? The costs of an airtight electricity system are not going to be low. And to what extent will we build those into consumer rates, or to what extent will investors bear those risks? I don't have the answers yet, but that balance is going to have to be struck probably in the regulatory process in Texas. And Texas has an opportunity that a lot of other jurisdictions don't have because it has a more coordinated regulatory system where the state has control now over the transmission part of the equation through ERCOT, as well as the power generation part of the equation, which other states control.
So Jim, do you see a regulatory way forward? I mean, is in your mind, is there a path that they can follow?
Well, I think Texas is going to be taking the lead for its own regulatory reforms because of the way the system is set up. I think part of the path forward will be making some policy choices about planning and the extent to which centralized planning about things like reserves and capacity, and as well as weatherization, the extent to which that will play a role in the Texas market. Against the backdrop of this, I think, is federal regulators will increasingly be attentive to things like the natural gas industry in Texas. And there's also that threat of potential federal regulation of ERCOT. I mean, that would take Congress making some changes, or would take a major regulatory initiative on the part of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. But all this, of course, will require a lot of coordination, both among federal regulators and state regulators.
Lisa, do you see an incentive issue that would bring investors into this equation in a more robust way?
I was going to say there are definitely a lot of reasons right now for investors to get into this space. I think, what's holding them back is, to what Jim said, is the elephant in the room is like the federal government's jurisdiction and some of the state public utility commissions in their jurisdiction, and what is going to come out of all of this, not just in Texas, but more broadly across the U.S. We are seeing the emergence right now of long-term battery storage on the grid. We are seeing the emergence of microgrids and other sorts of technologies. Obviously, with the upstarts of all these electric vehicle charging stations, you have a lot of people talking and actually moving forward with their business plans. And, energy has to be at the table to provide those products, right? Because you can't just build electric cars, install a charging station, and then the charging station can't charge cars. So there's a lot of reasons that investors can get some great returns out of this obvious demand and consumer preference. But the questions about how everyone gets compensated and what money you're willing to invest on a debt or equity basis, and are you getting paid at the right premiums? So I think there's a little bit of price discovery on the investor side. I think some areas are clearer. Grid transmission is a must. I agree with Bill. I also agree that our pipeline system needs more infrastructure. Our aging infrastructure is as bad as our bridge and tunnel situation, and for all the reasons from safety to cybersecurity, we have to kind of look along the spectrum to see where investors want to put their money, and ultimately they have to have some security in the sense that there's a long-term regulatory framework in place as to how everyone's going to share the costs and the risks.
Lisa, I don't want to jump the questions that Dean Johnson probably has in the queue, but one of the questions that's already been posed by an audience member relates to nuclear power and why nuclear power isn't a higher priority from green energy. From a green perspective and from a technical perspective, I think nuclear could be a great solution for zero carbon energy. But where are the investors? Why aren't they interested in this?
I think you have two types of investors. Some that are fundamentally opposed to it because of safety incidents and the imagery that they have of large nuclear. I think that there are other investors that are very bullish on the small reactor module nuclear technologies that are emerging and are looking to put money in some of those spaces. Now, have the traditional US banks really backed those projects? Not as much as I've seen, but that could change as we get clarity.
And when you talk about clarity, you're talking about regulatory clarity. Maybe the Biden administration gets behind this.
Correct.
And comes up with some tax benefit or some other benefit to.
Correct. And I think the other thing about it is, for those not as familiar in the industry, there's only one nuclear plant under construction right now, and it is billions overrun in the US. It has been a disaster. I think the negative press on that has chilled certain investors. I won't use the company's name, but it's public, and it's one of those things. It's like, well, if you only have one example of an under construction new baseload nuclear, and then that went wildly over budget, appetite gets really chilled really fast.
So we had Lynn Good here recently, I guess a little over a year ago now. Speaking of which, right, and CEO of Duke Energy, for those you don't know, and of course, she was very forceful in saying that nuclear was a big piece of their strategy, but the idea of building more nukes was not. That was my takeaway at the moment.
Yeah, yes, that has been Duke's public position.
Yeah. It's fascinating. Thank you, Mark Cox, for that question. It is a really great question, one that's kind of staring at us all the time.
But it has to be part of the solution. What we've talked about is you can't have demand quadruple and take baseload offline in large chunks of coal and nuclear and expect that, one, we even have the capacity to build new to replace. mean, these construction projects, whether it's, new gas plants or it's new renewables, the construction process takes time. And you're expecting that it's going to be online when the demand is needed, but, and you're taking something off. The permitting process for these sites has gotten harder and harder, as Katrina talked about. It's not in my backyard syndrome. No, getting land control, getting environmental assessments. We've upped the ante on all the items that a new build has to adhere to, and for right reasons, but that comes with time and cost.
Well, we're seeing more regulatory engagement, I could say, from a federal level, and it's not specifically in the remit of their responsibility. So as Lisa said, you're seeing some expansions in what they want to do. So traditionally, I can tell you the number of scenarios that we were initially, and if you filed for any kind of plan, you'd get like 4 or 5 scenarios from FERC to go back, and you have to show and require all of those. Now you're getting like 300, and then they don't still have to have a response after you give them the answers to 300. So from a developer or company standpoint, it becomes much more difficult to actually get your project over the line. And then we've also seen getting a permit doesn't necessarily mean that commercially you've got all your contracts in the chain. So you still can't go to FID, because maybe the guys had a better location for permitting, but commercially it doesn't make as much sense. So you have to ask yourself, how can we bridge that problem with the regulatory permitting in order to make the projects that make sense for the region be able to go forward? I mean, you're going to see it. Pipelines in the Northeast, those are definitely needed. Who doesn't? I mean, it's crazy to think that a pipeline is your worst enemy at this point, when, I have friends in the hill country who are still griping about the Kinder Morgan line right down the road. So I think it's an interesting part of our perspective, because, as a natural gas person, I spent 20 plus years replacing other fuels and quote, cleaning up. And it took coal 18 years to become a bad word in energy. It's taken natural gas 18 months. And that's a little bit off. It just doesn't really apply to the industry as people are applying it. So I think we need to understand better how we can use natural gas, but also some of the infrastructure that we are looking to permit now can be more readily transitioned to other types of projects, 15 years from now. These tanks that you build or things that you do, pipes that you put in, they are transitional, and you can utilize them later. It's not like a pipeline has a 20-year life. There's pipes in the ground and up north that are, put in 1920, and they're better than the pipes that were put in 1960. So I think you have to kind of look at your infrastructure, and if you're maintained properly, new is not always better. I'm going to say that. It kind of is counterintuitive, but it is actually true.
But to your point, it shouldn't matter what we put in those pipelines, but that it is a cheap and easy way to deliver, something to the end source, and, safely. And, whether it is natural gas or what we may see is the emergence in the US of green hydrogen.
Yeah.
It could be other forms of liquid fuels going through those pipes that can
just
be
need cryo pipes. Yeah. And there's a lot of, and that's what I like about liquid natural gas, because it's natural gas that's cooled to negative, 260 degrees. So it takes the volumetric portion down. So it's 1/600th of the size of vapor. Well, we can put it in ships and take it around the world. And so, you look at different countries that are evaluating how this transition should be managed. And I think it's not just us that are looking at this transition as we go forward. Europe talks a great talk about, we want everything to be green. The problem for Europe is, they are effectively going to tax it in. So if they tax it in, tell me why Bangladesh should pay more for their power than Europe should pay for theirs. And so proportionally, it's going to an energy tax that will affect the countries that need it the most, more so than anything else. And you'll see trading change around that in order to accommodate those versus Europe. And it kind of de-incentivizes some folks, and it shouldn't, this should be something that we work together on, and we have been in the past.
But traditionally, the way pipelines were built was through long-term contracts that were fuel specific. If that's the financing model for pipelines, how do we build out infrastructure that is more flexible in the future? I mean, if we need capacity for all kinds of fuels we can't even anticipate right now, or that don't even have investors right now, how do we finance these projects if we can't rely on the fuel specific?
Sure, and that's a good question. That's part of, the conundrum right now is if all fuels trade at different types of, valuations in different markets, how do you know what your revenue stream is going to be for the debt you want to put on a project, or that you may need to put on a project to construct it, or, maintain it? The obvious answer is, you're just not going to get the debt and equity maybe with the surety that you need to have 20 years out. Investors may take a view, but it may not be a view that you want to hear, because it's just a conservative of all, fuel expectations about when those fuel transitions may or may not happen based on some regulatory assumption.
Yeah, I think, and what we've seen is energy evolution. I've been doing this 25 years. And there were pipelines when I started in this business that were transporting natural gas, and now they're transporting oil. We saw during the broadband build out, the telecom world, that the 50-foot of corridor of right-of-way that the pipeline was laying in was pretty valuable, especially in a very heavily populated urban area. And so it is working with investors I have for 15 years, trying to get a return on their investment. We're pretty much looking at transferring energy, transmission, whether it's gas, oil, liquefied natural gas, NGLs, which is like ethane, propane, butane. And so we can transition some of those pipelines, especially some, as Katrina was saying, some of those pipelines are really old. But from we spend, as a company, we're one of the largest companies, we spend $600 million a year on maintaining our assets. That's a lot of capital that we spend just on maintenance. And so you may have, assets that are older, or we would say are more strategic. And it's getting even harder out of Washington these days when regulation comes out and you're shutting down the Keystone XL pipeline, which is trading Canadian oil for Middle Eastern oil here in the United States, which is a whole other debate. But you're saying you can't build new pipelines. Well, those that are in the ground, from an investor standpoint, are even more valuable today, because you can transition them, whether you're flying, putting vapor in there or some kind of liquid. So we see that, and we try, and that's what our investor base is looking for, is someone that's got the kind of footprint that we do, that can kind of continue to evolve the energy mix as we go forward.
And I totally agree with Bill on that, because honestly, my project that I'm working on right now is relying on picking up and relaying an existing pipe. So instead of having a new right of way where I'm going to have, just a nightmare to try to get a pipeline permitted, I'm relaying. And so it's already there. They're just picking it up, and instead of it being a 20-inch, it'll be a 36-inch line. So I think those types, but that will, again, locationally, maybe not put you exactly where you need to be. And I think that's where you get into the challenge of where can we best plug in the infrastructure to build our energy independence and be able to provide product around the world, because we may not be able to make even if we made every perfect change here in the United States, whatever you consider to be, the solution, it's really other areas of the world that will be much more affected by change, not ours. We've done quite a bit. If you look at our production chain, the methane capture on the pipelines, pipelines have always been big about capturing methane fugitive emissions, because then they can charge you per molecule for them, as Bill knows. So effectively, you look at a lot of those solutions, and I think, in the US, are we looking at these projects from a federal level are we looking at the global perspective or just our regional perspective? And that's where I think that it's going to be difficult, because I think different administrations view different things or try to say both. And you just, it can't be both ways. There has to be somebody's backyard.
So we still have some questions coming in, and I think one is more in your lane, Katrina, and that is, if natural gas is going to be the new baseline and help on the renewable side, what about the methane off-gassing piece of that? Is the industry going to address that?
I think the industry is addressing that. If you go back and look at the production capture of fugitive methane, you look at, there's EQT just announced they're doing Project Canary. So they're putting, monitors out there. There's a lot of different things. Pipelines are using solar for different compression. I know Enbridge has done some solar. You're looking at Williams. They've done a lot of different tactics in order to show, because they are committed to it. I love the pipelines though, because honestly, as Bill knows, pipelines want to capture every single bit, because then they get paid for it. From a production standpoint, these guys do too. And it's counterintuitive to think that they're just randomly letting volume go, because when volume goes, that's money that doesn't come in, and it doesn't support the value chain that they need to support. So effectively, each of those producers is taking their own tactic in order to address it. And you look at the Marcellus area, Marcellus has the lowest emissions of, fugitive carbon footprint of any of the regions. And I hate to say that because I'm a Texan, so it does bother me. But, Permian's actually not that bad. If you look at the chart, it's very interesting to see the regions that are more heavy in the emissions. And I think the pipelines have been ahead of us on some of this, and the producers who have always been kind of kept behind the curtain are now realizing that they have the same goals. They just are not able to communicate as openly with the public in some regard, because the public, I think right now, is bullet point. They're bullet point headline people, and it's very difficult to deal with. But there are a lot of efforts that have gone into play, and I think you should definitely watch for them. I don't know who asked the question, but definitely watch for how each of the regions is addressing it, because they want to. They don't want to be, we don't want to be the family member nobody wants to sit next to at Thanksgiving. It's just not our goal. And our goal is to keep the lights on and keep everything going forward. And that applies globally. I think we definitely understand the need for that transparency. And it's been building up, I'd say, over the last 4 years, quite a bit.
That's great. Thanks to David Wells for that question.
No, thank you, David. Sorry.
We're running towards the end here, but one of the questions that had come in earlier was, we're looking at ourselves most of the time, though we've been talking a little bit about other places in the world. How does the U.S. compare when we start thinking about these diverse portfolios? Jim, do you want to weigh in on that?
Well, I think the U.S. does have quite a degree of diversity in its fuel mix. Today, if you look at the electric sector, I think we're moving towards a nice division where it's about a quarter renewable, a quarter nuclear, a quarter coal, a quarter natural gas. So from that kind of a diversity perspective, I think the U.S. has made some progress. That's not to say that we can't improve on some fronts, but I do think that we have moved increasingly towards a pretty balanced system. And that's a big contrast from where we were 50 years ago, where it was really two primary fuel sources that we were relying on for electric power generation. So I think we've made progress on that front. And the focus, I think, increasingly will have to be looking at the system within the U.S. and thinking about kind of smart diversification of the system.
That's great. Well, I think we're going to have to leave it there for today. Boy, an hour goes quickly, but a great thank you to the panelists, Jim, Katrina, Lisa, Bill. What a stimulating conversation. It's just amazing how 60 minutes goes just like that. And certainly one that's really important, not just to our students and our alumni, but to the country and the world. And thank you so much for making today a success.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for having us.
Thank you very much.